Insight, the latest offering from VMware in the log analytics and log management sphere. We talked about how it helps you with automated management of logs through log aggregation, analytics, and such. Now, normally in these sessions, you typically have a presentation and Q&A at the end, or you have Q&A through the session. You want to flip that a little bit. We'll do Q&A first, we'll do the session later. And just to mess around a little more, we'll ask the questions, you give us the answer, right? So let's do that. Show of hands, who's heard about Log Insight before? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, we got 4 there. How did you hear about Log Insight? Hold up.
I heard about it part of the cloud program.
Okay. Any other different answers? Okay, good. So glad you guys are here. Do not know about Log Insight. Another question. Do you normally use any log management tools in your commercially available tools in your environment today? All right, we've got 1 hand here. 2. Everybody else is manual, command line, that kind of stuff. So what do you use?
We use a third-party company. They have their own proprietary. So we customize it all and identify the key events and something that we can notify the actual law like that.
How about you? Splunk. Okay.
So my question at the end is going to be that integrated.
We can talk about that. Alrighty.
Before you ask me the question.
Alright. So another one, right? Show of hands. The company you're coming from has less than 1,000 employees. About 4, 5. Right. More than 1,000, less than 5,000. 1. More than 5,000. Right. 4. Okay. Hopefully that adds up because I don't know what else to ask. Alright, what else do you want to ask? Oh yeah. So when it comes to virtualization management, are there other tools besides vCenter Server that you're using? Anybody using VC Ops? Veeam? vFoglight? vKernel? Alright. Any other random ones? Okay, cool. Okay, so that kind of takes care of the weird part of this session. Now let's talk about the actual stuff. So to give you a framework of what we'll talk about today, I'll start with what Log Insight is all about, right? What it is, why we're doing it, and how does it fit into the existing portfolio that VMware has today. We'll talk about some of the use cases of Log Insight, a little bit about the technology underlying it, and after all this preliminary stuff, we'll get into the good stuff, and Steve will give you this really cool demo on product usage, installation, configuration, etc. So when you start thinking about the cloud management portfolio that VMware offers, you essentially think about it in 3 core pillars. The first one is around cloud service provisioning, and that is around automated management of provisioning of infrastructure, services, apps, etc. The second one is around cloud ops management. The third one is cloud business management, where essentially you're thinking in terms of the business of IT, managing the management of vendors, SLAs, etc. All your IT assets. So if you think about Log Insight, it fits into that middle pillar where you see vCenter operations management suite as well. And as we go along, you'll see that there is that natural alignment between these 2 products, and they integrate well, they complement each other, and they offer that complete solution. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So when you think about Log Insight, the idea essentially is you take logs from all sorts of endpoints in your environment, whether it is your virtual infrastructure, your vSphere logs, or whether it is your physical servers, network devices, storage arrays, applications, sending all those logs to Log Insight to give you some meaningful insights, to help you, analyze, discover, search, and visualize that log data. There's something that I want to highlight when we talk about Log Insight. The first one is around the focus on analytics. So with vCenter operations, in fact, we talk a lot about patented analytics and the power that drives, when you start thinking about performance, capacity, config, management in an environment. We take that same approach of analytics and we extend that to log data with Log Insight. The second thing I want to highlight is around ease of use. Log Insight as a product is, it's a browser-based interface. It's extremely intuitive, very easy to use, and you do not need to learn a language to get started with Log Insight. You already know all you need to know to get started with Log Insight and get those benefits. Another thing is around the pricing model. So, others in this log management and log analytics space, they offer a pricing model which is based on the volume of log data you analyze. So the trouble with that is, you have problems in your environment, and you start collecting logs from all sorts of sources. If you exceed that threshold of whatever license you have, then you're in trouble. With Log Insight, we take care of that issue completely. We have a simple and predictable pricing model that is based on your environment itself. It's not based on log data. It in fact includes unlimited amounts of log data to be analyzed. We essentially focus on a per OSI basis, and an OSI is an OS instance. You can think of it as a VM or an endpoint that has an IP and it generates logs, right? So you can collect logs from all these sources, and then you can plan ahead, predictably what a log analytics solution is going to cost you over time. You do not have to worry about, suddenly if my devices get chatty, do I have enough licenses to be able to leverage the product actually, right? Another thing is that Log Insight is optimized for the VMware environment. Sorry.
So to clarify, the OSI is the number of OSs that report to your product.
So as I said, it's an OS instance essentially. So anything, whether it is a storage array or a network device as well, if it has an IP endpoint, you can think of it as an operating system or an app as well, sending logs into Log Insight. So we can think about VMs and that you're collecting log data from.
Just to extend on that, if you think of the RFC syslog format, there's a source field and a hostname field. We're talking about the hostname field, the unique identifier, the originator of the message. So if you're going through a syslog aggregator, that wouldn't count as a single device. It's everyone that's actually the originator of the syslog message.
All right. So as I said, right, there is the optimization for the VMware environment. So Log Insight includes built-in knowledge and native support for vSphere environments. There is something called a concept of content packs, and we'll go over that in more detail. Now, besides that, of course, as I said, you can connect all sorts of devices, all sorts of endpoints to Log Insight. So it's not restricted to just the VMware environment. When you start thinking about use cases, with the current release of 1.0 product, we are focused on things like troubleshooting, monitoring, root cause analysis, and as we go into future releases, we'll enable more strongly some of the other use cases around security, compliance monitoring, business transaction monitoring, etc. I mentioned vCenter operations earlier. There is solid complementarity and integration across Log Insight and vCenter operations, and we'll talk a little bit more in detail about that. Log Insight is generally available today. We went GA a couple of weeks back, in fact, and there is a 60-day free trial available. I think that's the perfect way for you to get started with it. There's no commitment as such, and so you can go to vmware.com/go/try-log-insight and get that 60-day free trial. So why is VMware entering this management space? There are a bunch of existing vendors already, right? First reason for it is customers are asking for it. We are increasingly seeing that log analytics as a capability is being talked of as a must-have by whether it is a small and medium business or a large enterprise. The second thing is the use cases we talked about. Those use cases get enabled by this log management space, and so that's another important reason for customers to need this. Log analytics is a complex problem. Right? When you start thinking about the scale of logs, right? A typical vSphere host can give you 250 nights of logs a day. Exchange server is going to give you up to a gig of logs a day. And when you start thinking over time, this accumulates into this big data scale, right? So you need a tool that is custom built to solve that particular problem. And that's where the idea is we are addressing that with log insight. So that you do not have to spend several hours multiple times a week digging through logs anymore. Log analytics is an emerging market. We found that through research that 73% of customers are, and I think that's probably a bigger percentage in this room, right? That customers are not using a log management solution. It's more either they're not using anything or it's very much command line based. And even so basically we see that the log management tools are not yet widely adopted. Some reasons are too expensive, complex to use. So we want to address all those things with log insight. So I talked about the customer research. Let's see what are some of the things that we talked about with them. One question we asked customers, and this is I think a size of about 125, is how much time do you spend analyzing log files? And about 60% said multiple times a week. 30% almost talk about multiple times a day. That's a lot of time spent analyzing log files. Especially if you do not have a proper management tool, that's a lot of operational efficiency gains that you are losing out on, right? Another question was, why do you need to analyze log files? So predictably, troubleshooting was the big one. And then security management was another important one that came up, about 75% of that. The other question was, what are you looking for in a log analytics solution? The most important thing that came up was ease of use. So the solution needs to be simple and easy for me to actually derive value out of it. Second one was licensing costs. That's another thing we talked about that we want to address with log insight. The third one is that shows up is integration with existing virtualization management tools. So we talked about how log insight and vCenter operations have this complementarity and integration across. So I think so talking about vCenter operations and the integration, if you think about this typical IT environment, right? So you have all sorts of data coming out of it. There's structured data, metrics, alerts, those kind of things that essentially are addressed by vCenter operations for performance, configuration, management, etc. Then there is unstructured data, all the logs and messages that are coming out, and that is where log insight addresses. Now, so you're essentially, you're looking at structured data and unstructured data, and we have the best of breed solutions to address those specific areas. You can't go with a one-size-fits-all approach, across everything. There has to be that differentiation, right? And both vCenter operations and log insight integrate well. So you can, if you're in log insight, you can send notifications and events into vCenter operations. If you're in VC ops, you can select an object, right-click, launch in context, and be able to see the logs that are coming out from that particular object. So there is that seamless transition from monitoring to troubleshooting. So as I mentioned before, right, together, log insight and VC ops offer you that complete solution addressing that gamut of data across your environment for a complete infrastructure and operations management. Quick overview in terms of the technology, and we'll see a lot more of this when we see it starts. But as I said, it's purpose-built for log analytics. Right? Supports streaming data, real-time queries. There's just-in-time schema definition which adapts to any kind of data format. There is that ease of use we talked about earlier, right? It is delivered as a virtual appliance, so the installation is a breeze compared to. You do not have to learn a new query language that I mentioned before. So that's another big one for in terms of being easy to use and knowing all you need to know to get started with log insight. And then there is the concept of content packs, where content pack essentially is a group of visualizations and charts based on best practices and subject matter expertise. So like the vSphere content pack essentially is built on the input from VMware experts, from the best practices, etc. So it is the authority when you start thinking about vSphere log analytics. And then similarly, you can start thinking about content packs coming from certain vendors, whether it is EMC or NetApp or Cisco or whatever, right? So that's the idea, that you do not have to figure out, once you connect that device to and start collecting logs, you do not have to think about, okay, so what should I be monitoring? What are the right ones? What are the big ones that I need to take care of? The content pack essentially shows you that kind of feedback, and then you can make changes. You can customize things as you like. And we'll see the content back in detail, what it looks like. All right, so now that you've survived listening to me, let's get to the good stuff. And we'll bring up to you and we give you install config and start there.
All right, so basically I want to walk you guys through deployment of the virtual appliance as well as initial configuration and how to actually use the product. Now, has anyone never deployed an OVA or OVF before? Pretty sure most people have. It's a pretty straightforward process. I'm going to walk you through it real quick. There's only one specific area I want to touch on. So basically I have the vSphere web UI up here. I just select the object I want to deploy my OVF template to, and then I go find the location of my file. So you download this from the my.vmware.com site. We have both a public beta that you can download as well as the GA version of the product. Right here I'm demonstrating the 1.0.4, which is the GA version of the product. The virtual appliance is a single virtual machine. It consists of 2 vCPU and 8 gigs of memory, as well as 132 gigabytes of local storage space by default. Of that, 100 gigabytes of space is used for your actual log messages. So you simply walk through this nice little deployment wizard, specify the name and where you want to put the virtual machine in your environment. And then you select the storage that you want to allocate it to. Now, one thing we do recommend is that you select the thick provision either zeroed option so that you have no additional overhead associated with your backend storage. The reason for that is because vCenter Log Insight is extremely IOPS intensive, so you just want to reduce the amount of overhead. It has a single network interface, and here's the one step that I'd like to point out. Several VApps, OVAs, OVFs have these network configurations during the deployments. This is extremely important for Log Insight as it's the only supported way to configure static information today. So if you want DHCP, you just leave this blank and continue. If you want to set a static IP address, DNS entries, or host name, you go ahead and enter that right here. Now, if you want to make changes to this after the fact, you simply power off the virtual machine, edit the settings, and adjust the VApp. Of course, the virtual appliance is just a Linux box, it's SLES-based. You could go ahead and change the static IP information from the command line, but we do not recommend that you do that, as it could get overwritten by the system. This is the supported way to set static information. And that's it for the deployment. Everything else is handled for you. You go ahead and power it on, and then you can go ahead and open up the console screen and see the first boot process. It takes a couple of minutes to get configured, but when you're done, you'll end up with this splash screen. I apologize, it's a little bit small and hard to read. But basically at the top, it lists the URL to interact with Log Insight. And most of your interactions with the product are through the web UI. Now, one thing I would like to point out is that it is a good idea to go ahead and change the password while you have the console screen up. The reason why I mention this is because SSH is actually disabled to the virtual appliance until you set the password. You set it through the console. So hit the appropriate key combination, log in as root. The default password is blank. It will force you to change it. Once you set the password and you follow the complexity requirements specified on the page, SSH is automatically enabled for you. There are a couple use cases where you will need SSH to the appliance, so it's probably good just to configure this when you deploy the virtual machine. Now that you have it deployed, you have the password set, you can SSH into it if you need to, you go ahead and open up the web UI. You enter the IP address, or if you have DNS configured, the FQDN to the device that you've configured, and you'll get this SSL security warning. This is because the virtual client ships with a self-signed cert, so go ahead and accept it, and you'll see the initial one-time configuration wizard. Configuration wizard is made up of a couple of steps here to get the system configured. The first is actually the admin credentials. So the admin users, when you log into the web UI, you are required to set a password here. This is how you defaultly log into the system. You can add additional users afterwards if you need to. Once you've entered the password, go ahead and save and continue. The next step is the license key. If you're using the public beta version of the product, the license key is already in the product for you. If not, you have to download it from the my.vmware.com site. You can install the trial key license, or if you purchase the product, you can install your permanent license. You go ahead and enter it. Next up is general configuration. This is made up of two different sections. One is the email systems notifications to dialog box. This is extremely important for any system notifications. So basically, let's say that you have 100 gigabytes of local log retention space and you've filled it. You're about to run out of space. So what Log Insight does is it goes ahead and retires or deletes that data from the virtual clients. It will go ahead and email you before it does that to let you know, hey, you're running out of space, maybe you want to add more. Or perhaps you've overscaled the environment and you're starting to drop events that are coming into the product. Log Insight will again send you an email notification. It's important to note this is email systems notification to dialog box is separate from the admin email address. The admin email address will not get you system notifications, so it's very important that you configure this one. The second part of the general configuration is the customer experience improvement program, or the call home functionality. Basically, this provides a way for the Log Insight team to figure out how the product is being used and any issues that are being experienced. So we recommend that you enable this if you're comfortable with it. So let me explain how it works. Basically, the virtual client ships with a public key, and VMware is the only one that has the private key. And there are log messages that Log Insight generates on the virtual clients. So on a weekly basis, those log messages can be collected and then anomalized. All your personal data would be removed. Host names, usernames, anything in there that would identify you as a customer, as a user of the product is removed from the log messages. Then it is encrypted and sent via email to VMware. Only VMware can open that email, and then it can use that information to determine any problems that customers are experiencing, as well as how the product's being used. You can go ahead and log into the virtual clients, and from the documentation you can click on it, it'll tell you exactly where that file is located. You can go ahead and view the contents of that directory and make sure you're comfortable with the data before it gets sent. Time configuration. This is another important aspect of vCenter Log Insight. And the reason for that is because as events are coming into the system, they're going to get a timestamp that says, hey, Log Insight saw this event at this time. And that's important when you're trying to do troubleshooting and root cause analysis. Let's say that someone says, well, hey, 10 o'clock yesterday I experienced a problem. We probably want to go look at 10 o'clock yesterday. But if you're not looking at the same time, it can be kind of challenging to find the events or to perform the root cause analysis. By default, we recommend using NTP servers. We go ahead and specify externally available NTP servers for you. You can go ahead and change this as appropriate to your environment. If you have internal NTP servers, you can go ahead and set them. If for whatever reason you do not have access to NTP servers, you can change this to use the ESX or ESXi host that Log Insight is running on, and it will go ahead and configure the time via VMware tools. Next up is SMTP configuration. Log Insight does have a mail server installed on it by default, but it may not work in your particular environment. Perhaps you're behind a firewall, you have special authentication in order to get out. You can go ahead and specify an SMTP server. I do recommend that you use the send test email button at the bottom just to validate that you're receiving the mail as you would expect. This is very important for the system email notifications I mentioned earlier, as well as any custom alerts that you configure in the system, and I'll demonstrate that in a few minutes. VMware integration. This is one of the great value adds of vCenter Log Insight. Today there are two different types of integrations that are allowed. One is with vCenter Server, the other is with vCenter Operations Manager. In both cases, you go ahead and supply the host name or IP address to the particular instance, as well as some credentials to log in. And it's bare minimum credentials. For vCenter Server, it's a read-only user account that is sufficient. For vCenter Operations Manager, a user privilege is sufficient. It's the minimum. So what does it buy you? For vCenter Server, it allows you to collect events, tasks, and alarms from vCenter Server. So if you've used the vSphere UI before, you know that there are events, tasks, and alarms. What you may not realize is that those events are not in log messages today. They are stored in the vCenter Server database. And the vCenter Server's database only has a certain amount of capacity and only retains those messages for so long. If you go ahead and enable this integration, then Log Insight via API calls can extract that information from the database and ingest it into Log Insight, so you can go ahead and query against it and configure alarms against it. Now you can go ahead and configure one or more vCenter Server instances per Log Insight instance. For vCenter Operations Manager, there's actually a two-way integration. The first is for configuring alarms in the system. What you'll see in a few minutes is that you can perform queries, and when you see a specific pattern match, you may want to be notified of it, as it may point to a potential problem in your environment. You can go ahead and have a configured alert and send that alert to vCenter Operations Manager. This is great if vCenter Operations Manager may not otherwise know of this issue. vCenter Operations Manager is great with structured data, and Log Insight is great for unstructured data. The other integration you see at the bottom is called Enable Launch in Context. This is available in vCenter Operations Manager 5.7.1. Basically allows you to drill down to any particular object from vCenter Operations Manager, and then from the Actions dialog box, you can go ahead and launch in Log Insight. And you'll get a specific query to the object that you're on, so you can see events specific to that object. You can go ahead and drill down further, perform root cause analysis, or figure out what's going on in your environment. Now, in both cases, it's a very good idea to go ahead and test, just to make sure that you have the network connectivity that you expect, as well as to validate that the credentials that you entered are working as expected. Now, the test can take a little while, 20, 30 seconds or so, depending on your environment. In terms of vCenter Server, nothing is actually installed in the vCenter Server instance. It's all done via API calls. For vCenter Operations Manager, you can think of it like a plugin in the environment. Once you see the test is successful, you can go ahead and save and continue. Now, one of the final things you can configure is storage configuration. I mentioned that there are 132 gigabytes of local storage space, of which 100 is used for log data. Now, you can expand that if needed. You can shut down the virtual appliance and add one or more virtual disks to increase the amount of local retention. As soon as you power it back on, that is reconfigured for you. The storage is automatically added. But at some point, you may just want to archive the data. In a lot of environments, we find that people only need to query over, say, the last 30 days of data, but they need to retain it for the next year or two, depending on the security or compliance reasons. And so we allow this through data archiving. If you select the checkbox here, it will open a dialog box below it, which allows you to specify an NFS amount, NFS v3. You go ahead and specify that location, and Log Insight will attempt to archive as soon as possible. As soon as, very shortly after it receives the message, it will attempt to archive. As well as being archived, it will remain locally on the virtual appliance for as long as possible. As soon as there is no longer space available on the virtual appliance, it's a first in, first out methodology of retiring or deleting data. Now, one thing to note is that data that has been retired from Log Insight but has been archived is no longer searchable. You can go ahead and re-import that data to search on it, but if it's just in the archive location, you will not be able to. And that's it for the initial configuration. Finally, all you need to do is restart the Log Insight process to make sure all the configuration changes you applied take effect, and then you'll get to actually see the web UI and how you actually interact with the product. Now, how the default splash screen looks when you first log in depends on if you're sending log messages to Log Insight already or not, or if you've enabled vCenter Server integration. After a certain amount of time, you'll actually see those events, tasks, and alarms show up. So in this particular environment, when I log in, you'll notice that it says that there is no imported data. Basically, no events have come into Log Insight yet. And so you can't really use the product until the first event has come into the system. You see it demonstrated here. So how do we configure devices to actually send their log messages to Log Insight? So for ESXi, we actually supply a command line tool for those that need it. Now, depending on your environment, you may or may not need to use this tool. Maybe during deployment, during Kickstart, say, you configure remote syslog destinations. If so, you're all set. Maybe you have your own PowerShell scripts or host profiles or a way of configuring a remote syslog destination. Again, you'd be all set. If not, there is a command line tool. It's not available in the web UI. This is one of the reasons why you'd actually have to log into the virtual appliance that you can use to configure your ESXi host to send log messages to Log Insight. And I'd like to go ahead and demonstrate that. So the tool is called configure-ESXi. It's in the default path. You can run it with the --h help flag, and it will go ahead and tell you all the parameters necessary. I'm sure that's very hard to read. So the goal here is to actually walk you through a couple of examples. Basically, you specify the credentials and a vCenter Server instance, and then you perform an operation. And there are three main types of operations. There's the -q flag for querying. It will tell you what your ESXi hosts are currently configured for remote syslog destinations. There's add and removing of remote syslog destinations. And finally, there's reloading of the syslog configuration. I'll explain why that's important in just a minute. Now, when you go ahead and do this and you supply credentials to log in, you'll notice that the configure ESXi script is very verbose. The first thing it tells you is that it goes through your inventory one at a time, so it can be kind of a time-consuming task. It will go ahead and print out what it finds. So if you can't read this, basically it's printing out every single host it's finding on the vCenter Server instance, and since I'm running with the -q flag here, what the targets are already configured on the device. Now if there's a problem, it'll go ahead and tell you that as well. Maybe kind of hard to see here, but in one of these instances I actually have an ESX host, and it tells me, hey, configure ESXi does not support configure ESX host. The reason for that is because we're making all these calls via an API, ESX does not support an API for configuring remote SysLog destinations. So in terms of supportability, Configure ESXi works with ESXi 4.0 integrated, and it can connect to vCenter Server 4.1. Now once you've queried and you can find the remote syslog destinations, you may want to go ahead and make a change to your environment. But the question is, do you want to make the change to your entire environment, i.e. everything on a vCenter Server instance, or to a specific subset of devices? So one flag that we support is the -h flag. Basically, you specify one or more ESXi hosts, comma separated, and we can restrict the operation to those hosts on a particular vCenter Server instance. Now, unfortunately, you cannot select any other object today, a data center, a cluster, a folder. It must be a host. Now, in this particular environment, I've gone ahead and specified 2 hosts in a vCenter Server instance, and I'm telling you to remove the remote syslog destination. As it turns out, the remote syslog destination I specified to remove is not configured on these hosts. You'll notice it says, hey, I noticed you tried to remove 25, but no changes are necessary. 25 is not configured. Again, it will gracefully handle errors as they come up. The one final thing I want to point out is the -r flag, the reload, and why that's important. There's actually a bug in ESXi 5.x that can impact your environment. The bug is as follows. Basically, if you have ESXi 5.x hosts that are configured to send syslog to a remote destination, and that remote syslog destination becomes unavailable, let's say you restart your log insight instance, or if you're using something like syslog-mg or rsyslog, you restart those processes. Or if you have a network connectivity issue, let's say, for example, a firewall change is made and no longer ESXi can talk to log insight. Well, when that happens, ESXi stops sending syslog messages. Even when the issue is fixed, the restart is completed, or the network connectivity has been restored, ESXi will not continue to send remote syslogs. In order to get it to work, we have to restart the syslog process on ESXi. That's why we specify the -r flag. That functionality will restart the process, and you will start receiving ESXi logs again. Now, in terms of impacted products, against the system. So I'd like to go ahead and demonstrate that next. Now, there are 2 main tabs in your interactive log insight. It's kind of hard to see as you see the banner on top, but below VLC it says Dashboards and Interactive Analytics. Those are the 2 main pages. Dashboards gives you a nice overview of your environment, and there are multiple different types of dashboards. There are My Dashboards, basically private to the user that is logged into the instance. There are shared dashboards that any user in the instance can see. And then there are a notion of content packs. Content packs, by default, you'll see that there's a vSphere content pack, provide you information about a subset of the events coming into your instance. For the vSphere content pack, you'll see we have a variety of different pages: ESX, storage, vCenter Server, events, tasks, and alarms. And a content pack is made up of a bunch of widgets. You'll see primarily here chart widgets, which are a good visual way of seeing your log messages. It's also an easy way to see if there are anomalies in your data, or things that you care about that you may actually want to drill down further. This is great for system administrators, for engineers, for monitoring teams, as well as executives. Executives may not actually care that much about the actual log messages that are coming into the system, but they do care about anomalies or patterns that are being seen. You can go ahead and collect that information through dashboards. I'll walk you through a couple of these pages really quickly. So if you look at the storage one here, you'll notice that there are actually buttons for every single chart. One of the buttons is an I, it stands for information. It's a way of getting additional information about your log messages. Now, unfortunately, this is cut off, you can't see it very well. But basically, it would tell you something additional about that chart. Why do I care about it? What's a good value? What's a bad value? Where can I learn more information? So the example here, which you cannot see too well, is that we have a chart that actually shows you SCSI sense codes. So something like 0x5, 0x20, 0x0. A lot of people don't know what that means, but there is a standard to it, and it does have a particular pattern. There are certain ones you should care about, and certain ones that you don't need to. In this information button at the bottom, there's actually a link that will take you to the site, which will tell you what code means what. It's a way of getting additional information about your log messages. Now, one other thing I want to point out is the event tasks and alarms. So if we've gone ahead and enabled vCenter Server integration, which I did during the initial configuration wizard, you'll get these nice graphs populated as well. And the reason why I point out this example is if you look in the top right-hand corner, that chart, you'll notice that there's one bar that is way higher than everything else. This is a quick visual way to see that there might be a potential problem in my environment.
So I can go ahead and mouse over to it and see what it is. It might be kind of hard to read, but it says esx.problem.vhclient.lease.none. So I now know that I have an ESX host, one or more, that has some sort of DHCP issue. That's probably a problem. So I want to go ahead and drill down further. I can now drill down to these log messages, find out which hosts are impacted, find out what the DHCP issue is, go engage my networking team. Quickly and easily, I'm getting information out of my log messages, and I didn't have to do anything. All I had to do was forward the messages to Log Insight. Log Insight is actually doing the work for me. That's the power of content packs. The other page is interactive analytics. It's a way of actually drilling down into your log messages. This is where system administrators and system engineers will spend a variety of their time. And this page is broken down into a variety of different views. At the very top with the black background, you'll see a visual representation of your data. This is very similar to the chart widgets that you saw on the dashboards page. In the bottom left-hand corner are actually the events that are coming into the system, the actual syslog messages. And dividing the two views is the search bar. The search bar is a full text or natural language query bar. There's no need to learn a proprietary query language. You just look for what you believe to be an issue or what you want to learn more about, and it will go ahead and refine the searches for you. So one classic example we like to do is some customer complains and says, hey, I have a performance issue. My VMs are running slow. And an administrator might know, well, hey, I know that the VMs this is running on are on a storage array that's kind of overloaded. So can I drill down and figure out what's going on? So one thing you can go ahead and do is search for something like SCSI performance. Again, full text, natural language searching, I can look for a potential storage issue and start typing in SCSI performance. And you'll notice a couple things here. First, as I start to type, the results are auto-populated for me. Second, for each of those results, you'll notice that there's actually a value on the right-hand side that gives you an approximation of the number of results returned for that particular query. So I can go ahead and run this query and see if I have any SCSI performance issues. And you notice that I get no results. Now the reason for this is because of the time range specified. You'll notice to the right of the search button, it says time range, latest 5 minutes of data. You can go ahead and expand this to a bigger range. But one thing to note is the larger the range, the more resource intensive the operation is. So you don't want to search over all the data in your environment. That can be very CPU and very IOPS intensive. You want to refine this search to a particular time that you know a problem was occurring. So if someone says 10 o'clock yesterday I had a performance problem, maybe I'll look between 9 and 11 yesterday. In this particular demo environment, I don't have a lot of data. I just went ahead and selected all data, and we'll see if we get any results. You notice that we go from 0 results to several results. I think it's close to 200 results. And you notice that what I searched for, SCSI performance, are actually highlighted in the event for me. Now I can drill down further. For example, you'll notice that there are SCSI improved and SCSI performance deteriorated messages. Deteriorated would point to a potential problem in my environment, so I can refine my search even further. Now the next thing I want to point out are actually the fields below the events. You'll notice that for every single row, which is an event message that's coming in, there are 1 or more links at the bottom. These are called fields. There are 3 different types of fields primarily. There are Log Insight custom-defined fields. You can think of these as metadata. So for example, if I have an RFC syslog compliant message coming in, there are certain fields that I know are going to be contained. For example, facility, priority, source, host name, and potentially app name. So these fields are extracted by Log Insight automatically. In addition, you can have other fields that are defined. So for example, you'll notice that there's a device ID in this message and a latency in microseconds that is specified. Now you'll notice that for these fields, when you hover over them, in parentheses it says vSphere. That's because it's part of the vSphere content pack. So the vSphere content pack has all those nice little chart widgets, but it also has these extracted fields for you predefined. Now extracted fields are powerful because they're a way of providing structure to unstructured messages. You see an event coming in, I see that there is a device ID and it says it's the latency, why don't I extract that information? Now you may be asking, why would I want to do that? And the reason is because you can then manipulate your data based on those extracted fields. Let's go ahead and demonstrate that. So one thing that you might care about is actually the average SCSI latency over time. And so I can go ahead and change the visual representation of data. It was count of events over time to average latency in micros over time. Now, I went a little bit too quick. The average is actually a list of functions. That drop-down menu, you can select a function that you want to perform, and then select the object you want to perform against. So So I'm saying average latency in micros over time. And now my visual graph, which is kind of hard to see, has changed from a bar graph to a nice line graph. And if you look all the way to the right, you can see there's actually a pretty steep increase in latency in my environment. This might point to a potential problem. So quickly and easily, I have a visual representation of my data that can tell me of potential problems. Now, the only problem with this particular graph is that this is an average fuzzy latency of every single device that is logging to log insight. I may have more than one. Maybe only one is experiencing performance issues. So I want to go ahead and see it on a per device basis. In addition to the functions, we can also do groupings. By default, this is over time. Why don't I go ahead and add device ID? And now I have a stacked line chart. Basically, I have the average fuzzy latency for each device. And I can now see, and it's kind of hard, but in the right-hand corner, the blue line is the one that spiked up significantly. So I now know I have a single data store that is experiencing some increased latency. I probably want to go drill down, figure out which host it's connected to, figure out if maybe I have too many VMs subscribed to it, an IOPS issue, maybe I need to engage my storage admin. But I'm starting to get useful information. I can drill down further to get even more. Now I can also look for something like maximum latency. Average is nice, but maximum will tell me of potential peaks in my environment as well. Again, it upgrades the graph. You'll see I went from about 500,000 or a half second of latency up to over 2 million seconds of latency. And I can refine this further. Let me add a constraint. It's a way of further refining my results. Constraints are important for a variety of reasons. One is they allow me to perform regular expression matching. Perhaps I want to do text and search for some sort of regex. I can do that. Or I want to perform a query over one or more extracted fields. Again, I can do that with constraints. So you'll see I added a constraint here. On the dropdown, I've selected my latency in microseconds, and I have the ability to specify some sort of operation. So in this case, I'm going to see if I see latency more than 1 million microseconds, that's more than a second, then I know it's a problem in my environment. I care about this. So I go ahead and add a constraint, look for more than 1 million. It's going to be kind of hard to see, but there are actually results in the top right-hand corner. You can see me hovering over it there. This is useful information. And the question is, what can I do with this useful information? I have a couple of options. One, I can configure an alarm. Every single time I see this, I want to be notified about it. So let's go ahead and do that. Next to the search button, there's a menu drop-down. One of the options, add alert. There are two different ways to send an alert today. One is email, that's why the SMTP configuration is important. This is one of those custom-defined alerts I was talking about. The other is send to vCenter Operations Manager, assuming you've enabled that integration, which I did during the initial configuration wizard. With vCenter Operations Manager, I can go ahead and specify a resource I want this to trigger against. In my particular case, I'm just selecting the vCenter server object. You can pick whatever object is applicable to your environment. And the criticality of the alert. If I'm seeing more than a second of latency, it's pretty important. The final thing is how I want the alert to be raised. It's basically threshold. And right now I have it set to anytime you see a match, go ahead and notify me. And now I'll get an alert over in VCOps. I'll demonstrate that in a couple minutes. Another thing you can do is add to dashboard. This is a way for you to save this query so you never have to type it in again. The constraints, the fields, the functions, the groupings, all that information is saved for you. You can rerun it whenever you want. It's now in your own user space, either the My Dashboards or the shared dashboards, depending on how you saved it. And you can save one or more dashboards. You'll see I saved maximum, and now I've saved average. Let me run you through one more example. Let's go look at alarms in the vCenter server database. We've enabled that. So I can search for something like alarms change from and to. Again, I have to change my time range to see data over a broader range in the environment. You'll notice that this looks a little bit different. The reason for that is because it's not an RFC syslog compliant message. It's from the vCenter server database. So we have some different fields available to us. We also have some additional extracted fields that are part of the vSphere content pack, namely type and status. But one thing that's not extracted for us is actually the object that's sending the alert. So you'll see that VMware vCenter log insight 2 is the object that actually triggered an alarm. Let's go ahead and extract the field. You'll see that I just selected any part of the log message, and I got an option to extract a field. Once I go ahead and do that, log insight tries to determine a pattern match for me. And there are 3 different values that need to be entered. What you're actually searching for, the value that's highlighted and looks like yellow, but it should be a darker green. The pre-context, which is before the pattern, and the post-context, after the pattern. Now, log insight attempts to deduce all this information for you, but it may not get it 100% correct. You need to go ahead and validate it and make changes as appropriate. So let's scroll down and take a look. you'll notice that this pattern matches, but it actually matched out of an alarm. So this story is actually not that good, or not optimized. So we can go ahead and change the extracted field context so that it matches what we expect. In this case, it should only match data store 1. So let's change the pre-context. Let's add alarm. Let's look for anything as short as possible instead of single quotes. That's a regular expression. And then on. And now look, now our pattern matches and we're only matching data store 1. This looks great. Let's give it a name. How about something like VC alarm object? We can go ahead and test it. When we test it, we now have that value available to us on the row of the events. We can hover over it and validate that it's working. It is. Great, we can now save it. And now that it's saved, we can use it. We can use it in a constraint. We can use it in a function. We can use it in a grouping. Quickly and easily, we can now extract or provide structure to our unstructured events. I want to talk about groupings a little bit more. Let's go ahead and group by status. So I'm now doing a count to events over time, group by status. Again, kind of hard to see here, but this is a stacked bar chart. And every different color represents a different value. So you'll see that I'm hovering over what looks like a darker blue here, and that's saying green. The lighter blue says gray. There are a couple smaller ones, one of them says red. So I can quickly and easily see the different types of alarms that are coming into my particular system. This might be useful, I can go ahead and save it. But it's only useful if you have a small number of results. For example, let's change the status to type. So we'll group by count of events over time, group by type. And again, we're going to get a stacked bar chart. It's kind of hard to see here, but these stacked bar charts, there's a lot of different values. You'll notice that it's changing as I hover over the different things. It's kind of hard to see. So to make it better, one thing you can do is remove the time series, and you can get a grouping from greater to less of the type of alerts that are coming in. You notice the virtual machine CPU and memory utilization are the number 1 and number 2 results. That might point to a problem in my environment. I can go drill down and find out which virtual machines are impacted and do my best to reduce those numbers, so that I'll make my executive or management team happy. Now let's switch over to the dashboard page. All those charts that I saved in this demonstration are now available to me, and I save them in my dashboards. I can go ahead and manipulate this representation as well. For example, maybe maximum and average latency I want to be stacked on top of each other. Maybe I want to expand one graph and make it larger. Maybe I want to rename them. All this is possible from the dashboards page. And what I'm demonstrating here is basically how you go about creating a content pack. Sure, this is in my dashboards, but all the information that you can save from the dashboards page or the interactive analytics page can be used to construct a content pack. This is how content pack authors make content packs. So once you're done, you've actually a gear in the upper right-hand corner next to the VMware vCenter Log Insight logo. One of the options is content packs. I can go ahead and drill down to the particular dashboard I save my information to. I can export that information, one click. Give it a name, I get a VLCP file, and that's it. I can now import that VLCP file into any other Log Insight instance and reuse it. So you can make your own content packs today. And one of the final things I want to demonstrate for you is the vCenter operations integration. So I have the vSphere UI up here, running 5.7.1. I drilled down to an ESX host. I'm on our operations events, and we have a nice heat graph chart for you. One of the new buttons in 5.7.1 is the Show Notification Events button, this orange button right here. If you go ahead and select it, it'll get populated on the graph. And you'll notice that we now have events that show up that say Log Insight and what the event is. For example, high SCSI latency, one of the alarms that I created earlier. The other option I have is in the Actions drop-down menu, I have the launching context that I was mentioning before. Basically, I can go ahead and search for logs in vCenter Log Insight. I'll get taken to the interactive analytics page, and I'll have a query specific to this object, VSX03.matrix. Now, what I'm demonstrating is the vSphere UI. If you're running the advanced or enterprise edition of vCenter Operations Manager, you can also see this from the custom UI as well. When we go ahead and run this, you'll see I get switched over immediately to vCenter Log Insight. I'm on the interactive analytics page, and I have a constraint added for hostname equals ESX03.matrix. That will return results appropriate to that object. And that's it for my quick demonstration. Now I guess we'll open it up for the next slide. Right?
So now that you've kind of heard about login site, you've seen the demo, you've seen how easy and quickly you can install it, configure it, start getting value out of it. Make sure that
How can I define relationships between log entries? Suppose I'm logging requests and responses, right? So I have a way, I might be able to match up the request with its response. Is there a way of doing that?
So if it's in the log message itself, then sure, you can do an extracted
Okay,
field.
I'm gonna have two log messages and they're related. One is a request,
Yep.
and then sometime later there's a reply. And let's just assume that in those messages, I have some sort of request identifier that I expect to see in the request, and I expect to see repeated in the reply. Is there a way to
So you have a couple options. You can create dashboard charts for each type of object. So like log in, log out, for example, depending on what you're trying to do. And you can compare those two graphs. If you have an extracted field, you can go ahead and extract the field and look for the deltas between them. And you can do like the stack bar chart that I showed. If you're looking for something like a join operation to join two different log messages together, that's not supported today, but that will be available in the future.
So I want to highlight a couple of things. We talked about login sites, so we have the highlights there. I'm going to call out the free 60-day trial that's available. Again, VMware.com/try login site. And we have recently launched the login site community site, loginsite.ideascale.com. And so you can go in, join the community, ask your questions, have those conversations, build your content pack, and share it within your organization or within the community. So those are the two things I want to highlight for you to, as an action, I can go back and get the free trial, start using it, and then you can, if you have questions, etc., join the community and have a conversation. And go ahead, if you have, at this point, if anyone has questions, feel free.
on one of the screens you showed that you client time and the server time, there's some difference between the two. Is there any way to be correct for if you're looking at similar logs, is there any way you can correct for the time differential between different logs?
Can you elaborate a little bit further on this trend?
Well, suppose I have two different nodes that produce logs, but if the time is not perfectly synchronized, I won't be able to correct for that.
Yep. So you can't change the actual event that's coming into the system. So if you're looking at the timestamp in the event, you can't do anything about that. But I wish I had a slide I could show you. To the right of the actual event message in gray, there's another timestamp. That's the timestamp that it came into login site. So that will be consistent across events, and that's what you actually query against. So there is a way to make sure that they're in sync versus what they actually say. Yes.
All right. Any other questions? This is your chance. So I have a question for you. I'm not going to ask it, I'm going to get a question. So we talked about content packs, right? We talked about the vSphere content pack that we have and that we can build. What kind of content packs would you like to see in your environment? If you have log data coming in, what kind of content packs would you be hoping for that login site should include?
This could be infrastructure, network devices, storage arrays, it could be applications, web servers, it could be VMware products, it could be third-party products. What would you be looking for in your log messages?
Cisco UCS.
Cisco UCS, yeah? Great. Anything else?
You got a smile on your face, you got something, tell me.
No, it's still, with my initial question, integration with third-party systems. Besides the UCAs and other device system, how do they scale it to other
Expand on that a little
to other systems like Splunk or even Serengeti is another. I'd like to.
bit. So talking about like integration across, for example, login site and Splunk.
And even use it for big data. You just accumulate a lot of data over time. And you guys have Serengeti there, we don't care much.
So we've got plans currently for any integration with Flanders. I think there's lots involved for that to happen for sure. But yeah, I think the focus again with Log Insight at this point in time is all about once the 1.0 is out, the focus is on building the content packs for things like Cisco UCS or storage arrays from EMC and applications, et cetera, et cetera. And I think we can explore things as well. Yeah.
I think some of the target audiences are different too. Like vCenter Log Insights, right now you're going to see a lot of integration with VMware products. There's really no one else in the market that has that tight integration of log messages for VMware specific products today. So if you compare it to something like Splunk's a different offering. They're targeting a different audience. They're much broader for what they're trying to get for log messages. So there are parallels for sure, but I'm not sure there's necessarily integration per se.
Well, I think some customers who use, Splunk and also,
Sure. So you can do that with a syslog aggregator, syslog ng, our syslog, and you can have it send certain traffic to one destination and certain traffic to another. There are definitely solutions to do it, but I'm not sure that Splunk and Log Insight necessarily would talk to each other per se.
just exploring it because sometimes customers come with all kinds of questions.
If there are no other questions, thank you so much for giving us your time and listening to us.